Well, if you know anything about American history, you know that Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant man. Largely the author of the Declaration of Independence, the third president of the United States. If you've ever been to Monticello, I'm sure that you were impressed with what you witnessed in that structure. But Thomas Jefferson was a skeptic as far as the miraculous is concerned. I understand that during his life, he, in a notebook, wrote down snippets from the four Gospels. And after his death, that notebook was published under the title, The Jefferson Bible. And this is the way the Jefferson Bible ends. And rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. Because Mr. Jefferson was a skeptic concerning the miraculous, in his Bible, Jesus lived and died and was buried, but Jesus' body remained in the tomb. Of course, the New Testament paints a very different picture. The New Testament tells us that Jesus lived and died, was buried, but also that he was resurrected, that he arose victorious over death. And I think the question that we must consider is simply this: will the real Jesus please stand up? Is the real Jesus the Jesus of the Jefferson Bible, or the Jesus portrayed in the New Testament? But perhaps we need to ask a second question, and that is, can this question be answered definitively? Many folks in our society today reject the resurrection as unprovable because they reject anything but scientific evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, it is true that the resurrection of Jesus cannot be proven scientifically. To prove the resurrection scientifically, we would have to be able to repeat what happened in a controlled environment so that observations could be made, data obtained, and hypotheses empirically verified. Needless to say, this is impossible. But of course, that is also the case with every other historical event that has happened in the past. But I would suggest to you that this does not mean that the resurrection of Jesus is unprovable. Simon Greenleaf, former Royal Professor and Dane Professor of Law at Harvard University, had this to say: in all human transactions, the highest degree of assurance to which we can arrive, short of the evidence of our own senses, is that of probability. The most that can be asserted is that the narrative is more likely to be true than false, and it may be in the highest degree more likely, but it still be short of absolute mathematical certainty. Yet this very probability may be so great as to satisfy the mind of the most cautious and enforce the assent of the most reluctant and unbelieving. If it is such as usually satisfies reasonable men in matters of ordinary transaction, it is all which the greatest skeptic has a right to require. if Jesus really lived and he really died and he was really seen alive again by credible witnesses, then the resurrection of Jesus is proven on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And folks, this is the accepted method of proof in almost every area of life. Our knowledge of historical events is based upon the testimony of others. How do we know that Alexander the Great conquered the world? How do we know that George Washington was the first president of the United States? How do we know that Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo? How do we know that Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address? Well, we know all of those things, not because we were there, because we experienced those things with our five senses. We know these things on the basis of reliable witnesses who testified to those things. May I remind you that most of our knowledge of current events is really based upon the testimony of other people. We get this testimony in newspapers, well, maybe not as much as we used to, or magazines, or television, or radio, or the internet. But most of our knowledge of current events is based upon the word of somebody else. How do you know that a cargo ship hit a bridge in Baltimore and destroyed that bridge? You've heard about that, right? You've probably seen pictures, right? You do know that pictures can be doctored, right? And yet I believe that happened. You believe that happened, don't you? But it's not because you were there. You haven't seen that or the wreckage with your own eyes. And yet you believe that, and you believe that so strongly that there's no doubt in your mind. Our whole system of jurisprudence is largely based upon this method of proof. By an examination of the evidence, by the testimony of eyewitnesses, whether written or oral, jurors make decisions, even life and death decisions. And so it is with the resurrection of Jesus. If the resurrection, or rather the witnesses, are convincing and credible, then we can accept this phenomenal event. If not, it must be rejected as fabrication and fantasy, or at least unproven. And so this morning, I'm going to ask each one of you to play the part of a juror as we consider the resurrection of Jesus, and we ask the question, is it a fact or is it fiction? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the proceedings that will follow, we will address three things. First of all, we will present facts that must be explained. And folks, that's all we're going to do this morning. Secondly, we will consider the possible explanations of these facts, and that's for a future lesson or lessons. And then, after we've done all of that, each one of you will be asked to render a verdict, not publicly, but render a verdict in your own heart and mind. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as you sit in judgment as a juror on the resurrection of Jesus, there are several pertinent facts that must be explained. And the first fact that I bring to your attention is that Jesus really existed. He really lived. Now, the historicity of Jesus has been questioned by some in the past, but it is not questioned today. The historicity of Jesus has been established beyond any reasonable doubt. No reputable scholar today would deny the fact that Jesus of Nazareth really lived. In fact, we have the testimony of both friend and foe. We, of course, have the testimony of the New Testament documents. And may I remind you that the records in the Gospels are grounded in history. That's not the nature of legends and myths. And though it's true that some folks want to dismiss the testimony of the New Testament because they say these men were biased, and therefore we can't accept their testimony, may I remind you that nearly all historical information comes from those with a particular point of view. In fact, we can't avoid having a particular point of view. And may I remind you that the Bible has demonstrated remarkable historical accuracy down throughout the ages. But in addition to the testimony of the New Testament documents, we have the testimony of the church fathers, men who wrote in the 2nd, 3rd, and following centuries after the time of Jesus and the apostles. And then we also have the testimony of secular historians. I noted some time ago when Brother John DeGrow filled in for me in my absence, I noticed on the website that he talked with you about the historicity of Jesus. Now, because of other matters, I didn't take the time to listen to that recording. But John can confirm with a nod of his head as to whether or not he shared with you the statements of secular writers to the effect that Jesus lived. Well, John just kind of gave me a wink and he nodded his head yes. I figured that's what John would do. Now, I can't take the time to actually share with you their statements, but I will tell you, and I trust that John has already shared much of that information, the Roman historian Tacitus talked about Jesus in his work, The Annals. And another historian by the name of Suetonius talked about Jesus in his work, The Life of Claudius. And then the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus mentions Jesus 2 different times in his work, The Antiquities of the Jews. Jesus is mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. He is mentioned in a letter by Pliny the Younger. He is mentioned in a letter by a fellow named Mara bar Serapion. And he is mentioned by Thales and Lucian of Samosata and Mara bar Serapion. Did I have that on there twice? Okay, my secretary's done it again. There's just all kinds of testimony that Jesus really lived. And there's absolutely no good reason to doubt that at all. Dr. Gary Habermas is considered to be one of the foremost scholars concerning the resurrection of Jesus. He has written multiple volumes addressing this issue. He has just recently published a volume entitled Evidence, and it is over 1,000 pages. And he says it's the first of 4 volumes. And Dr. Habermas says, within 100 to 150 years after the birth of Christ, approximately 18 non-Christian extra-biblical sources from secular history mention more than 100 facts, beliefs, and teachings from the life of Christ, including almost every detail of Jesus' life, including miracles, the resurrection, and his claims to be deity. The noted historian F.F. Bruce says some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the ground of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. And then he says, it is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theories. Otto Betts says no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus. And Cornfield, a Jewish scholar, and by the way, an unbeliever. He said modern archaeology and scholarship have now established beyond all doubt that a man known as Jesus certainly did exist in history, and that the criticism of the skeptics was ill-founded. He goes on to say, we are today able to assert beyond a shadow of a doubt that the historical Jesus existed. And so we begin with that pertinent fact. But then in the second place, may I remind you that the Old Testament prophesied the Messiah's resurrection. I suggested to Randy that he read to us from Acts chapter 2 in his opening remarks this morning, because in Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, he quotes from Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11, affirming that that particular psalm was fulfilled in the resurrection of Jesus. Notice what Jesus said in Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 25. Luke 24:25. Then he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? Jesus is saying that the Scriptures, the Old Testament Scriptures, had prophesied that the Messiah would suffer and then enter into his glory. Look at what he says down in verse 44. Then he said to them, These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures. Then he said to them, Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sin should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Other writers like John and Paul affirm that the Old Testament Scriptures prophesied the resurrection of the Messiah. That is one of the pertinent facts that you must explain as you sit in judgment as a juror concerning the resurrection of Jesus. You also must consider the fact that Jesus himself prophesied his own resurrection on several occasions. In fact, Jesus made 4 clear predictions of his resurrection during his public ministry, and he hinted at it on other occasions as well. In Caesarea Philippi, while Jesus was in Galilee, while he was on his way to Jerusalem 2 days prior to his death. And you can see from this chart that these predictions are multiply attested to in the Synoptic Gospels. Well, what did Jesus say? Well, we can't take the time to read these passages, but the chart before you summarizes what Jesus told his apostles. We'll just notice his last prediction. He is on the road to Jerusalem to be crucified, and he told the apostles that he would be delivered to the chief priests and scribes. They would condemn him to death. He would be delivered to the Gentiles. He would be mocked and scourged and spit upon. Please notice that this is new information that Jesus had not mentioned earlier. And that he told the disciples that he would be killed and that he would rise again on the 3rd day. That's when James and John asked Jesus for thrones to sit on at his right and his left hand. And so Jesus, on more than one occasion, prophesied that he would die, be buried, and then raised again the 3rd day. That is a fact that must be explained. And then Jesus was crucified. Wilbur Smith writes, "Let it simply be said that we know more about the details of the hours immediately before and after the actual death of Jesus in and near Jerusalem than we know about the death of any other one man in all the ancient world." That's saying a lot. We have more information, Mr. Smith is telling us, about the death of Jesus than we have about the death of Aristotle or Socrates or Julius Caesar or any other person who lived in the ancient world. And then one of the facts that must be explained or dealt with is the fact that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb. Mr. Smith says we know more about the burial of the Lord Jesus than we know of the burial of any single character in all of ancient history. And Jesus' interment was witnessed by at least 4 different individuals. John tells us in his gospel that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate requesting the body of Jesus. His request was granted, and he, with the help of Nicodemus, you remember him, the man who came to Jesus by night. I want to talk to you about him one of these days. The 2 of them buried Jesus. And as we noted in our study this morning in the 9 o'clock hour, that burial was witnessed by both Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. They were looking on, observing what was going on intently. And may I suggest to you that there are some very significant things about the tomb of Jesus that we need to remember and reckon with. John tells us that the tomb of Joseph was in a garden. It was in a particular locality. And that garden was near the crucifixion site. It was Joseph's own tomb. Do you suppose Joseph would know where his own tomb was? And as I've already mentioned, the location of the tomb was observed by 4 different people. And it was a new tomb. No mistake could have been made by seeing the bodies or the bones of others long dead. And then we are told that this tomb was hewn out of solid rock. Do you know what that means? It wasn't a cave that might have multiple entrances. No, not that at all. It was hewn out of solid rock, and that means there was only one entrance and only one exit. And the entrance to that tomb was covered by a very large stone. A stone so large that 3 of the women, when they journeyed to the tomb early that Sunday morning, they were wondering among themselves, who's going to roll away the stone for us? I think it was this morning as I was going to pick up Roger and Tyree and Dawn. I was listening to the radio, and David Jeremiah was talking about the resurrection, and he said it's been estimated that the stone that covered the opening of Jesus' tomb would have weighed somewhere around 1.5 to 2 tons. Did I remember that right, Roger? I think I did. 1.5 to 2 tons. And then it was guarded by soldiers. And a Roman seal was attached to the stone. I think when I was a boy growing up and I read about the sealing of the tomb, my concept was, well, it was kind of like you put caulking around a window, to seal and secure everything. That's not the idea at all. That was the purpose of the stone. The stone kept Jesus in. Well, it really didn't do that, did it? It kept everybody else out. The Roman seal, though, well, let Henry Alford explain that to you. He says the sealing was by means of a cord or string passing across the stone at the mouth of the sepulchre and fastened at either end of the rock by sealing clay. You see, the Roman seal was to discourage and or detect any tampering. Where's Jeff? What do they call that yellow tape that the police put up when there's a crime scene? Caution tape. Well, it's kind of like the caution tape. That Roman seal means you don't mess with this. You stay clear of this. Well, Jesus' burial in the tomb is a fact that must be dealt with as we consider the resurrection of Jesus. And then the gospel accounts tell us that the tomb was empty 3 days later. And folks, that is a fact that is universally acknowledged by both believers and unbelievers alike. The tomb was empty. The tomb that had been closed and sealed and guarded was found unguarded and unsealed and open. And the empty tomb was witnessed by at least 6 of Jesus' followers. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, Joanna, a little later, Peter and John, remember, Mary Magdalene ran to Peter and John and said, "He's not there, somebody's taken Jesus." And Peter and John ran to the tomb. And they found it empty. But folks, it's not just these believers who said the tomb was empty. At least some of the guards said it was empty. You can't accuse them of bias. Some of the guards went to the Jewish leaders and told them, "The tomb's empty, what do we do?" Well, we'll talk about what they told these guards a little bit later. Not today. Brother Jim McGuigan, in his book If God Came, writes, "Not even the enemies of Christ or Christianity ever denied that the tomb was empty after they had had it sealed and guarded. In fact, the opposite is true. The enemies affirmed that the tomb was empty." Now that's significant. And once again, Kornfeld, a noted Jewish historian, editor, publisher, and unbeliever, he has not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. He writes, "Accordingly, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, in which Jesus was buried, was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter, and no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, and archaeology that would disprove this statement." And then, there were many alleged sightings of Jesus for a period of 40 days. The gospel writers tell us that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, to two women as they returned from the sepulchre, to Simon, to Cleopas and the other disciple on the road to Emmaus, to the 11 and others on that first Sunday evening. Thomas was absent. Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to more than 500 brethren on one occasion. He tells us that Jesus appeared to his brother James, that he appeared to the apostles a week later, and then sometime after that, Jesus appeared to Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and two others at the Sea of Tiberias, and that Jesus appeared to the 11 when the Great Commission was given in Galilee, and then again to the 11 in Jerusalem, and then to the 11 on the Mount of Olives near Bethany when Jesus ascended into heaven. And then these alleged sightings of Jesus suddenly stopped. That's a pertinent fact that you must explain as a juror, as you sit in judgment on the resurrection of Jesus, to determine, is it a fact or fiction? And then the New Testament tells us that there was a tremendous transformation in the disciples of Jesus. Before the tomb was found empty, all of the apostles forsook Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when they came and arrested him. Peter and the beloved disciple later followed Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but that was when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, even after he swore that he would never do something like that. And on that first Sunday evening, after the death of Jesus, the apostles were huddled together behind closed doors. Some believe that the doors were locked. The apostles were in utter despair and without hope. But after the tomb was found empty, things changed, and they changed dramatically. Their hope was restored. 50 days after the Passover, the apostles were not cowering behind locked doors. Rather, they were publicly and boldly proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus to a group of Jews in the thousands who had come to Jerusalem to observe that Jewish feast. What transformed the cowards of Passover into the heroes of Pentecost? That is something that must be explained. And in subsequent weeks, they filled Jerusalem with their teaching. Another fact that must be dealt with is that the resurrection message was quickly accepted by many. Luke tells us that 3,000 people accepted the gospel message on the day of Pentecost. And there is no evidence that anyone attempted to disprove the apostles' claims on that occasion. Luke goes on to tell us in the latter part of Acts chapter 2 that the number of disciples increased on a daily basis for a time, to such an extent that the number of the men grew to be about 5,000. That's Acts chapter 4, verse 4. Acts chapter 6, verse 7 tells us that many of the Jewish priests became obedient to the faith. And these early believers in the resurrection accepted this amazing testimony despite the fact that the apostles indicted them as Jesus' murderers. Over and over again, the apostles told the Jews in Jerusalem, "You killed Jesus, and Jesus was the Messiah, and God raised him from the dead." These early disciples became believers in Jesus despite the fact that they had to forsake the religion of their forefathers. But then, of course, these early disciples, these early believers in the resurrection were in the best possible position to test the veracity of the apostles' claims. You see, they could examine the credentials of the witnesses, and they could compare the various eyewitness accounts. They could visit the tomb. They could interview the soldiers. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, may I remind you that the correct explanation of the empty tomb must adequately account for the widespread acceptance of the resurrection by those who heard the testimony of the witnesses. And then in addition to that, the number of believers grew rapidly, even in the face of persecution. And when believers were scattered from Jerusalem due to the persecution of Saul of Tarsus, they took the resurrection message throughout the Roman Empire, and within 30 years of Jesus' death, churches were found throughout that empire. Not only Jewish priests, but members of Caesar's own household, Paul says in Philippians 4:22, became followers of Jesus. And all of this occurred even though the earliest disciples could claim no synagogue, they wielded no sword, their message was seemingly preposterous to the human mind. They preached Jesus as God in a land of monotheism. They proclaimed the truth of a crucified Savior that was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentile mind. They preached the bodily resurrection of Jesus who had been slain. And they preached strict morality that flew in the face of Roman culture. Jim McGuigan writes, they gained no converts by pandering to the wants of a decadent age. The saints called on people to repent and turn from sins. They spelled out the crimes of society and the monstrous conduct of the populace as a whole. They spared no one. They groveled at no one's feet, nor would they lower the claims of their master to have the lordship over their lives so that they would gain followers. F.W. Farrar says, yet unaided by any, opposed by all, Christianity won. Without one earthly weapon, she faced the legionary masses and, tearing down their adored eagles, replaced them by the sacred monogram of her victorious labarum. She made her instrument of a slave's agony a symbol more glorious than the latticlip of councils or the diadem of kings. Forgot that those big words were in that quotation. But then also, James became a believer. The brother of Jesus. Now that is significant because the gospel writers tell us that the brothers of Jesus did not believe in him. John chapter 7. One of the other gospel writers tell us that his own, I'm assuming that means his family, they thought that Jesus was out of his mind. But then we find James assembled with the women and the apostles in the upper room, Acts chapter 1. And we read further in the book of Acts, and we see that James is one of the pillars in the Jerusalem church. How do we explain that? And then Saul of Tarsus became a believer. A rabid persecutor of Christians, who threw Christians in prison, signed his name to their death warrant, so to speak. He becomes arguably the greatest first century proclaimer of the gospel. How do we explain that? And then, the resurrection of Jesus was the cornerstone of first century preaching. It was the heart and soul of the gospel message. Time and time and time again, in the sermons or the sermon summaries preserved for us in the book of Acts, they talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And then many suffered and died for their faith in the resurrection. We read about some of those early martyrs in the New Testament. We read about the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7. Saul being responsible for the deaths of some Christians. James was slain by the sword by Herod Agrippa I. We read about the suffering of Paul and his willingness to die. We read about a fellow named Antipas who had given his life. Did the apostles die for their faith? Well, it's obvious from what I've already said that all of the apostles believed that they had seen the risen Jesus after his death, and they were willing to suffer and die for that belief. We see evidence of that in Acts chapter 4 and 5. But did the apostles die as martyrs? Well, let me say that there's good historical evidence that 4 of the apostles did. We have 10 sources from the 1st and 2nd century concerning the death of Peter. 8 sources from the 1st and 2nd century concerning the death of Paul. Evidence in the book of Acts for the death of James, the son of Zebedee, and also Christian testimony in the 2nd century. 1st century evidence from the writings of Josephus concerning the death of James, the brother of Jesus, and also Gnostic sources in the 2nd century. There's weaker evidence for 2 others, Andrew and Thomas. That evidence comes from the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, and there's even weaker evidence for 8 more. That evidence is late, it's contradictory, it's hard to distinguish legend from history. And so I don't know that we can prove that all of the apostles, except John, died a martyr's death. But I think we've got good evidence that that was the case for some. And then may I remind you that Christianity has thrived. I've put that word in quotation marks. Christianity has thrived for 2,000 years. The church is in existence. The New Testament is here. There are Christian symbols like Sunday worship, the Lord's Supper, baptism. That is a fact that must be explained. These are the facts that must be explained. Jesus really lived. The Old Testament prophesied the Messiah's resurrection. Jesus prophesied his resurrection. Jesus was crucified. His body was placed in a sealed and guarded tomb. That tomb was found empty 3 days later. There were many alleged sightings of Jesus after his crucifixion for 40 days. There was a tremendous transformation in the disciples. The resurrection message was quickly accepted. The number of believers grew rapidly. James became a believer, then Saul. It was the cornerstone of first century preaching. Many suffered and died for their faith in the resurrection, and Christianity has thrived for 2,000 years. 15 facts that you must explain as you consider whether the resurrection is fact or fiction. There have been many explanations that have been offered. And we'll begin to examine those, Lord willing, next Sunday. You've listened carefully, and I appreciate your kind attention. I hope our study will prove to be helpful to all of us. Paul explained in the passage that Gary read to us a little while ago that if Christ is not raised, then there's no hope for us. I believe that Jesus was raised. And that is a guarantee, Paul says in Acts 17, that one day God will judge the world. And that means we need to be ready for that judgment. And if your life is not right with God, we urge you to get right with Him. We extend to you an invitation to do that right now as we stand and we sing.